Chapter 7 of the Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 7. There had been a dinner party and a very small reception afterwards at the Great Embassy in Carlton House Terrace. The ambassador, Prince Terniloff, was bidding farewell to his wife's cousin, the Princess Eiderstrom, the last of his guests. She drew him on one side for a moment. "Your Excellency," she said, "I have been hoping for a word with you all the evening." "And I with you, dear Stephanie," he answered. "It is very early. Let us sit down for a moment." He led her towards a settee, but she shook her head. "You have an appointment at 11:30, she said. "I wish you to keep it." "You know, then." "I lunched to-day at the Carlton Grill Room. In the reception room I came face to face with Leopold von Ragastein." The ambassador made no remark. It seemed to be his wish to hear first all that his companion had to say. After a moment's pause, she continued. "I spoke to him, and he denied himself. To me! I think that those were the most terrible seconds of my life. I have never suffered more. I shall never suffer so much again." "It was most unfortunate," the Prince murmured sympathetically. "This evening," she went on, "I received a visit from a man whom I took at first to be an insignificant member of the German bourgeoisie. I learnt something of his true position later. He came to me to explain that Leopold was engaged in this country on secret service, that he was passing under the name which he gave me, Sir Everard Dominey, an English baronet long lost in Africa. You know of this?" "I know that to-night I am receiving a visit from Sir Everard Dominey." "He is to work under your auspices?" "By no means," the Prince rejoined warmly. "I am not favourably inclined towards this network of espionage. The school of diplomacy in which I have been brought up tries to work without such ignoble means." "One realizes that," she said. "Leopold is coming, however, to-night to pay his respects to you." "He is waiting for me now in my study," the ambassador asserted. "You will do me the service of conveying to him a message from me," she continued. "This man Seaman pointed out to me the unwisdom of any association between myself and Leopold under present conditions. I listened to all that he had to say. I reserved my decision. I have now considered the matter. I will compromise with necessity. I will be content with the acquaintance of Sir Everard Dominey, but that I will have. For myself," the ambassador reflected, "I do not even know what Von Ragastein's mission over here is, but if in Berlin they decide that, for the more complete preservation of his incognito, association between you and him is undesirable." She laid her fingers upon his arm. "Stop!" she ordered. "I am not of Berlin. I am not a German. I am not even an Austrian. I am Hungarian, and though I am willing to study your interests, I am not willing to place them before my own life. I make terms, but I do not surrender. Those terms I will discuss with Leopold. Ah, be kind to me," she went on with a sudden change of voice. "Since these few minutes at midday I have lived in a dream. Only one thing can quiet me. I must speak to him. I must decide with him what I will do. You will help?" "An acquaintance between you and Sir Everard Dominey," he admitted, "is certainly a perfectly natural thing." "Look at me," she begged. He turned and looked into her face. Underneath her beautiful eyes were dark lines. There was something pitiful about the curve of her mouth. He remembered that although she had carried herself throughout the evening with all the dignity which was second nature to her, he had overheard more than one sympathetic comment upon her appearance. "I can see that you are suffering," he remarked kindly. "My eyes are hot, and inside I am on fire," she continued. "I must speak to Leopold. Frida has asked me to stay and talk to her for an hour. My car waits. Arrange that he drives me home. Oh, believe me, dear friend, I am a very human woman, and there is nothing in the world to be gained by treating me as though I were of wood or stone. Tonight I can see him without observation. If you refuse, I shall take other means. I will make no promises. I will not even promise that I will not call out before him in the streets that he is a liar, that his life is a lie. I will call him Leopold von Ragastein." "Hush!" he begged her. "Stephanie, you are nervous. I have not yet answered your entreaty. You consent?" "I consent," he promised. "After our interview, I shall bring the young man to Frida's room and present him. You will be there. He can offer you his escort." She suddenly stooped and kissed his hand. An immense relief was in her face. "Now I will keep you no longer. Frida is waiting for me." The Ambassador strolled thoughtfully away into his own den at the back of the house, where Dominey was waiting for him. "I am glad to see you," the former said, holding out his hand. "For 5 minutes I desire to talk to your real self. After that, for the rest of your time in England, I will respect your new identity." Dominey bowed in silence. His host pointed to the sideboard. "Come," he continued, "there are cigars and cigarettes at your elbow, whisky and soda on the sideboard. Make yourself at home in that chair there. Africa has really changed you very little. Do you remember our previous meeting in Saxony?" "I remember it perfectly, Your Excellency." "His Majesty knew how to keep court in those days," the Ambassador went on. "One was tempted to believe oneself at an English country party. However, that much of the past. You know, of course, that I entirely disapprove of your present position here?" "I gathered as much, Your Excellency." "We will have no reserves with one another," the Prince declared, lighting a cigar. "I know quite well that you form part of a network of espionage in this country which I consider wholly unnecessary. That is simply a question of method. I have no doubt that you are here with the same object as I am, the object which the Kaiser has declared to me with his own lips is nearest to his heart, to cement the bonds of friendship between Germany and England. You believe, sir, that that is possible?" "I am convinced of it," was the earnest reply. "I do not know what the exact nature of your work over here is to be, but I am glad to have an opportunity of putting before you my convictions. I believe that in Berlin the character of some of the leading statesmen here has been misunderstood and misrepresented. I find on all sides of me an earnest and sincere desire for peace. I have convinced myself that there is not a single statesman in this country who is desirous of war with Germany." Dominey was listening intently, with the air of one who hears unexpected things. "But, Your Excellency," he ventured, "what about the matter from our point of view? There are a great many in our country whom you and I know of, who look forward to a war with England as inevitable. Germany must become, we all believe, the greatest empire in the world. She must climb there, as one of our friends once said, with her foot upon the neck of the British lion." "You are out of date," the Ambassador declared earnestly. "I see now why they sent you to me. Those days have passed. There is room in the world for Great Britain and for Germany. The disintegration of Russia in the near future is a certainty. It is eastward that we must look for any great extension of territory." "These things have been decided?" "Absolutely. They form the soul of my mission here. My mandate is one of peace, and the more I see of English statesmen, and the more I understand the British outlook, the more sanguine I am as to the success of my efforts. This is why all this outside espionage with which Seaman is so largely concerned seems to me at times unwise and unnecessary." "And my own mission?" Dominey inquired. "Its nature," the Prince replied, "is not as yet divulged, but if, as I have been given to understand, it is to become closely connected with my own, then I am very sure you will presently find that its text also is peace." Dominey rose to his feet, prepared to take his leave. "These matters will be solved for us," he murmured. "There is just one word more, on a somewhat more private matter," Terniloff said in an altered tone. "The Princess Eiderstrom is upstairs." "In this house?" "Waiting for a word with you. Our friend Seaman has been with her this evening." I understand that she is content to subscribe to the present situation. She makes one condition, however, and that she insists upon it that I present Sir Everard Dominey." The latter did not attempt to conceal his perturbation. "I need scarcely point out to you, sir," he protested, "that any association between the Princess and myself is likely to largely increase the difficulties of my position here." The Ambassador sighed. "I quite appreciate that," he admitted. "Both Seaman and I have endeavoured to reason with her. But, as you are doubtless aware, the Princess is a woman of very strong will. She is also very powerfully placed here, and it is the urgent desire of the Court at Berlin to placate in every way the Hungarian nobility. You will understand, of course, that I speak from a political point of view only. I cannot ignore the fact of your unfortunate relations with the late Prince, but in considering the present position you will, I am sure, remember the greater interests." His visitor was silent for a moment. "You say that the Princess is waiting here?" "She is with my wife, and asked for your escort home. My wife also looks forward to the pleasure of renewing her acquaintance with you." "I shall accept your Excellency's guidance in the matter," Dominey decided. The Princess Terniloff was a woman of world culture, an artist, and still an extremely attractive woman. She received the visitor whom her husband brought to her in a very charming little room furnished after the style of the simplest French period, and she did her best to relieve the strain of what she understood must be a somewhat trying moment. "We are delighted to welcome you to London, Sir Everard Dominey," she said, taking his hand, "and I hope that we shall often see you here. I want to present you to my cousin, who is interested in you, I must tell you frankly, because of your likeness to a very dear friend of hers. Stephanie, this is Sir Everard Dominey, the Princess Eiderstrom." Stephanie, who was seated upon the couch from which her cousin had just risen, held out her hand to Dominey, who made her a very low and formal bow. Her gown was of unrelieved black. Wonderful diamonds flashed around her neck, and she wore also a tiara fashioned after the Hungarian style, a little low on her forehead. Her manner and tone still indicated some measure of rebellion against the situation. "You have forgiven me for my insistence this morning?" she asked. "It was hard for me to believe that you were not indeed the person for whom I mistook you." "Other people have spoken to me of the likeness," Dominey replied. "It is a matter of regret to me that I can claim to be no more than a simple Norfolk baronet." "Without any previous experience of European courts?" "Without any at all." "Your German is wonderfully pure for an untravelled man." "Languages were the sole accomplishment I brought away from my misspent school days." "You are not going to bury yourself in Norfolk, Sir Everard?" the Princess Terniloff inquired. "Norfolk is very near London these days," Dominey replied, "and I have experienced more than my share of solitude during the last few years. I hope to spend a portion of my time there." "You must dine with us one night," the Princess insisted, "and tell us about Africa. My husband would be so interested." "You are very kind." Stephanie rose slowly to her feet, leaned gracefully over, and kissed her hostess on both cheeks, and submitted her hand to the Prince, who raised it to his lips. Then she turned to Dominey. "Will you be so kind as to see me home?" she asked. "Afterwards my car can take you on wherever you choose to go." "I shall be very happy," Dominey assented. He, too, made his farewells. A servant in the hall handed him his hat and coat, and he took his place in the car by Stephanie's side. She touched the electric switch as they glided off. The car was in darkness. "I think," she murmured, "that I could not have borne another moment of this juggling with words. Leopold, we are alone." He caught the flash of her jewels, the soft brilliance of her eyes as she leaned towards him. His voice sounded, even to himself, harsh and strident. "You mistake, Princess. My name is not Leopold. I am Everard Dominey." "Oh, I know that you are very obstinate," she said softly, "very obstinate and very devoted to your marvellous country. But you have a soul, Leopold. You know that there are human duties as great as any your country ever imposed upon you. You know what I look for from you, what I must find from you, or go down into hell, ashamed and miserable." He felt his throat suddenly dry. "Listen," he muttered. "Until the hour strikes, I must remain to you, as to the world, alone or in a crowd, Everard Dominey. There is one way, and one way only of carrying through my appointed task." She gave a little hysterical sob. "Wait," she begged. "I will answer you in a moment. Give me your hand." He opened the fingers which he had kept clenched together, and he felt the hot grip of her hand, holding his passionately, drawing it toward her until the fingers of her other hand, too, fell upon it. So she sat for several moments. "Leopold," she continued presently, "I understand. You are afraid that I shall betray our love. You have reason. I am full of impulses and passion, as you know, but I have restraint. What we are to one another when we are alone, no soul in this world need know. I will be careful. I swear it. I will never even look at you as though my heart ached for your notice, when we are in the presence of other people. You shall come and see me as seldom as you wish. I will receive you only as often as you say. But don't treat me like this. Tell me you have come back. Throw off this hideous mask, if it be only for a moment." He sat quite still, although her hands were tearing at his, her lips and eyes beseeching him. "Whatever may come afterwards," he pronounced inexorably, "until the time arrives, I am Everard Dominey. I cannot take advantage of your feelings for Leopold von Ragastein. He is not here. He is in Africa. Perhaps some day he will come back to you, and be all that you wish." She flung his hands away. He felt her eyes burning into his, this time with something more like furious curiosity. "Let me look at you," she cried. "Let me be sure. Is this just some ghastly change, or are you an impostor? My heart is growing chilled. Are you the man I have waited for all these years? Are you the man to whom I have given my lips, for whose sake I offered up my reputation as a sacrifice? The man who slew my husband and left me?" "I was exiled," he reminded her, his own voice shaking with emotion. "You know that. So far as other things are concerned, I am exiled now. I am working out my expiation." She leaned back in her seat with an air of exhaustion, her eyes closed. Then the car drove in through some iron gates and stopped in front of her door, which was immediately opened. A footman hurried out. She turned to Dominey. "You will not enter?" she pleaded. "For a short time?" "If you will permit me to pay you a visit, it will give me great pleasure," he answered formally. "I will call, if I may, on my return from Norfolk." She gave him her hand with a sad smile. "Let my people take you wherever you want to go," she invited. "And remember," she added, dropping her voice, "I do not admit defeat. This is not the last word between us." She disappeared in some state, escorted through the great front door of one of London's few palaces by an attractive major domo and footmen in the livery of her house. Dominey drove back to the Carlton, where in the lounge he found the band playing, crowds still sitting around, amongst whom Seaman was conspicuous, in his neat dinner clothes and with his cherubic air of inviting attention from prospective new acquaintances. He greeted Dominey enthusiastically. "Come," he exclaimed, "I am weary of solitude. I have seen scarcely a face that I recognize. My tongue is parched with inaction. I like to talk, and there has been no one to talk to. I might as well have opened up my little house in Forest Hill." "I'll talk to you if you like," Dominey promised a little grimly, glancing at the clock and hastily ordering a whisky and soda. "I will begin by telling you this," he added, lowering his tone. "I have discovered the greatest danger I shall have to face during my enterprise." "What is that?" "A woman, the Princess Eiderstrom." Seaman lit one of his inevitable cigars and threw one of his short fat legs over the other. He gazed for a moment with an air of satisfaction at his small foot, neatly encased in court shoes. "You surprise me," he confessed. "I have considered the matter. I cannot see any great difficulty." "Then you must be closing your eyes to it wilfully," Dominey retorted, "or else you are wholly ignorant of the Princess's temperament and disposition." "I believe I appreciate both," Seaman replied, "but I still do not see any peculiar difficulty in the situation. As an English nobleman, you have a perfect right to enjoy the friendship of the Princess Eiderstrom." "And I thought you were a man of sentiment," Dominey scoffed. "I thought you understood a little of human nature. Stephanie Eiderstrom is Hungarian born and bred. Even race has never taught her self-restraint. You don't seriously suppose that after all these years, after all she has suffered, and she has suffered, she is going to be content with an emasculated form of friendship? I talk to you without reserve, Seaman. She made it very plain tonight that she is going to be content with nothing of the sort." "What takes place between you in private?" Seaman began. "Rubbish!" his companion interrupted. "The Princess is an impulsive, a passionate, a distinctly primitive woman, with a good deal of the wild animal in her still. Plots or political necessities are not likely to count a snap of the fingers with her." "But surely," Seaman protested, "she must understand that your country has claimed you for a great work?" Dominey shook his head. "She is not a German," he pointed out. "On the contrary, like a great many other Hungarians, I think she rather dislikes Germany and Germans. Her only concern is the personal question between us. She considers that every moment of the rest of my life should be devoted to her." "Perhaps it is as well," Seaman remarked, "that you have arranged to go down tomorrow to Dominey. I will think out a scheme. Something must be done to pacify her." The lights were being put out. The two men rose a little unwillingly. Dominey felt singularly indisposed for sleep, but anxious at the same time to get rid of his companion. They strolled into the darkened hall of the hotel together. "I will deal with the matter for you as well as I can," Seaman promised. "To my mind, your greatest difficulty will be encountered tomorrow. You know what you have to deal with down at Dominey." Dominey's face was very set and grave. "I am prepared," he said. Seaman still hesitated. "Do you remember," he asked, "that when we talked over your plans at Cape Town, you showed me a picture of Lady Dominey?" "I remember. May I have one more look at it?" Dominey, with fingers that trembled a little, drew from the breast pocket of his coat a leather case, and from that a worn picture. The two men looked at it side by side beneath one of the electric standards which had been left burning. The face was that of a girl, almost a child, and the great eyes seemed filled with a queer, appealing light. There was something of the same suggestion to be found in the lips, a certain helplessness, an appeal for love and protection to some stronger being. Seaman turned away with a little grunt and commented, "Permitting myself to reassume for a moment or two the ordinary sentiments of an ordinary human being, I would sooner have a dozen of your princesses to deal with than the original of that picture." End of Chapter 7. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 8 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 8. "Your ancestral home," Mr. Mangan observed, as the car turned the first bend in the grass-grown avenue and Dominey Hall came into sight. "Damned fine house, too." His companion made no reply. A storm had come up during the last few minutes, and, as though he felt the cold, he had dragged his hat over his eyes and turned his coat collar up to his ears. The house with its great double front was now clearly visible, the time-worn Elizabethan red brick outline that faced the park southwards, and the stone-supported, grim and weather-stained back which confronted the marshes and the sea. Mr. Mangan continued to make amiable conversation. "We have kept the old place weather-tight, somehow or other," he said, "and I don't think you'll miss the timber much. We've taken it as far as possible from the outlying woods." "Any from the Black Wood?" Dominey asked, without turning his head. Not a stump, he replied, and for a very excellent reason. Not one of the woodmen would ever go near the place. The superstition remains then. The villagers are absolutely rabid about it. There are at least a dozen who declare that they have seen the ghost of Roger Unthank, and a score or more who will swear by all that is holy that they have heard his call at night. Does he still select the park and the terrace outside the house for his midnight perambulations? Dominey inquired. The lawyer hesitated. The idea is, I believe, he said, that the ghost makes his way out from the wood and sits on the terrace underneath Lady Dominey's window. All bunkum, of course, but I can assure you that every servant and caretaker we've had there has given notice within a month. That is the sole reason why I haven't ventured to recommend long ago that you should get rid of Mrs. Unthank." "She is still in attendance upon Lady Dominey, then?" "Simply because we couldn't get anyone else to stay there," the lawyer explained, "and her ladyship positively declines to leave the Hall. Between ourselves, I think it's time a change was made. We'll have a chat after dinner, if you've no objection. You see, we've left all the trees in the park," he went on, with an air of satisfaction. "Beautiful place this, in the springtime. I was down last May for a night, and I never saw such buttercups in my life. The cows here were almost up to their knees in pasture, and the bluebells in the home woods were wonderful. The whole of the little painting colony down at Flankney turned themselves loose upon the place last spring." "Some of the old wall is down, I see," Dominey remarked with a frown, as he gazed towards the enclosed kitchen garden. Mr. Mangan was momentarily surprised. "That wall has been down, to my knowledge, for 20 years," he reminded his companion. Dominey nodded. "I had forgotten," he muttered. "We wrote you, by the by," the lawyer continued, "suggesting the sale of one or two of the pictures to form a fund for repairs, but thank goodness you didn't reply. We'll have some work people here as soon as you've decided what you'd like done. I'm afraid," he added, as they turned in through some iron gates and entered the last suite in front of the house, "you won't find many familiar faces to welcome you. There's Lovibond, the gardener, whom you would scarcely remember, and Middleton, the head keeper, who has really been a godsend so far as the game is concerned. No one at all indoors except Mrs. Unthank." The car drew up at that moment in front of the great porch. There was nothing in the shape of a reception. They had even to ring the bell before the door was opened by a manservant sent down a few days previously from town. In the background, wearing a brown velveteen coat with breeches and leggings of corduroy, stood an elderly man with white side whiskers and skin as brown as a piece of parchment, leaning heavily upon a long ash stick. Half a dozen maidservants, new importations, were visible in the background, and a second man was taking possession of the luggage. Mr. Mangan took charge of the proceedings. "Middleton," he said, resting his hand upon the old man's shoulder, "here's your master come back again. Sir Everard was very pleased to hear that you were still here. And you, Lovibond." The old man grasped the hand which Dominey stretched out with both of his. "I'm right glad you're back again, Squire," he said, looking at him with curious intentness, "and yet the words of welcome stick in my throat." "Sorry you feel like that about it, Middleton," Dominey said pleasantly. "What is the trouble about my coming back?" "There's no trouble, Squire," the old man replied. "That's a joy, leastways to us. It's what it may turn out to be for you which makes one hold back like." Dominey drew himself more than ever erect, a commanding figure in the little group. "You will feel better about it when we have had a day or two with the pheasants, Middleton," he said reassuringly. "You have not changed much, Lovibond," he added, turning to the man who had fallen a little into the background, very stiff and uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes. "I thank 'ee, Squire," the latter replied a little awkwardly, with a motion of his hand towards his forehead. "I can't say the same for you, sir. Them furrin parts has filled you out and hardened you. I'll take the liberty of saying that I should never have recognized you, sir, and that's sure." "This is Parkins," Mr. Mangan went on, pushing his way once more into the foreground, "the butler whom I engaged in London, and—" There was a queer and instantaneous silence. The little group of maidservants, who had been exchanging whispered confidences as to their new master's appearance, were suddenly dumb. All eyes were turned in one direction. A woman whose advent had been unperceived, but who had evidently issued from one of the recesses of the hall, stood suddenly before them all. She was as thin as a lath, dressed in severe black, with grey hair brushed back from her head, and not even a white collar at her neck. Her face was long and narrow, her features curiously large, her eyes filled with anger. She spoke very slowly, but with some trace in her intonation of a north country dialect. "There's no place in this house for you, Everard Dominey," she said, standing in front of him as though to bar his progress. "I wrote last night to stop you, but you've shown indecent haste in coming. There's no place here for a murderer. Get back where you came from, back to your hiding." "My good woman," Mangan gasped, "this is really too much." "I've not come to bandy words with lawyers," the woman retorted. "I've come to speak to him. Can you face me, Everard Dominey, you who murdered my son and made a mad woman of your wife?" The lawyer would have answered her, but Dominey waved him aside. "Mrs. Unthank," he said sternly, "return to your duties at once, and understand that this house is mine, to enter or leave when I choose." She was speechless for a moment, amazed at the firmness of his words. "The house may be yours, Sir Everard Dominey," she said threateningly, "but there's one part of it at least in which you won't dare to show yourself." "You forget yourself, woman," he replied coldly. "Be so good as to return to your mistress at once, announce my coming, and say that I wait only for her permission before presenting myself in her apartments." The woman laughed unpleasantly, horribly. Her eyes were fixed upon Dominey curiously. "Those are brave words," she said. "You've come back a harder man. Let me look at you." She moved a foot or two to where the light was better. Very slowly a frown developed upon her forehead. The longer she looked, the less assured she became. "There are things in your face I miss," she muttered. Mr. Mangan was glad of an opportunity of asserting himself. "The fact is scarcely important, Mrs. Unthank," he said angrily. "If you will allow me to give you a word of advice, you will treat your master with the respect to which his position here entitles him." Once more the woman blazed up. "Respect! What respect have I for the murderer of my son? Respect! Well, if he stays here against my bidding, perhaps her ladyship will show him what respect means." She turned around and disappeared. Every one began bustling about the luggage and talking at once. Mr. Mangan took his patron's arm and led him across the hall. "My dear Sir Everard," he said anxiously, "I am most distressed that this should have occurred. I thought that the woman would probably be sullen, but I had no idea that she would dare to attempt such an outrageous proceeding." "She is still, I presume, the only companion whom Lady Dominey will tolerate?" Dominey inquired with a sigh. "I fear so," the lawyer admitted. "Nevertheless, we must see Doctor Harrison in the morning. It must be understood distinctly that if she is suffered to remain, she adopts an entirely different attitude. I never heard anything so preposterous in all my life. I shall pay her a visit myself after dinner. You will feel quite at home here in the library, Sir Everard." Mr. Mangan went on, throwing open the door of a very fine apartment on the seaward side of the house. "Grand view from these windows, especially since we've had a few of the trees cut down. I see that Parkins has set out the sherry. Cocktails, I'm afraid, are an institution you will have to inaugurate down here. You'll be grateful to me when I tell you one thing, Sir Everard. We've been hard pressed more than once, but we haven't sold a single bottle of wine out of the cellars." Dominey accepted the glass of sherry which the lawyer had poured out, but made no movement towards drinking it. He seemed during the last few minutes to have been wrapped in a brown study. "Mangan," he asked a little abruptly, "is it the popular belief down here that I killed Roger Unthank?" The lawyer set down the decanter and coughed. "A plain answer," Dominey insisted. Mr. Mangan adapted himself to the situation. He was beginning to understand his client. "I am perfectly certain, Sir Everard," he confessed, "that there isn't a soul in these parts who isn't convinced of it. They believe that there was a fight, and that you had the best of it. Forgive me," Dominey continued, "if I seem to ask unnecessary questions. Remember that I spent the first portion of my exile in Africa in a very determined effort to blot out the memory of everything that had happened to me earlier in life. So that is the popular belief?" "The popular belief seems to match fairly well with the facts," Mr. Mangan declared, wielding the decanter again in view of his client's more reasonable manner. "At the time of your unfortunate visit to the Hall, Miss Felbrigg was living practically alone at the vicarage after her uncle's sudden death there, with Mrs. Unthank as housekeeper. Roger Unthank's infatuation for her was patent to the whole neighbourhood, and a source of great annoyance in Miss Felbrigg. I am convinced that at no time did Lady Dominey give the young man the slightest encouragement." "Has any one ever believed the contrary?" Dominey demanded. "Not a soul," was the emphatic reply. "Nevertheless, when you came down, fell in love with Miss Felbrigg, and carried her off, every one felt that there would be trouble." "Roger Unthank was a lunatic," Dominey pronounced deliberately. "His behaviour from the first was the behaviour of a madman. The Eugene Aram type of village schoolmaster gradually drifting into positive insanity," Mangan acquiesced. "So far every one is agreed. The mystery began when he came back from his holidays and heard the news." "The sequel was perfectly simple," Dominey observed. "We met at the north end of the Black Wood one evening, and he attacked me like a madman. I suppose I had to some extent the best of it, but when I got back to the Hall my arm was broken, I was covered with blood, and half unconscious. By some cruel stroke of fortune, almost the first person I saw was Lady Dominey. The shock was too much for her. She fainted, and has never been quite herself since," the lawyer concluded. "Most tragic. The cruelest part of it was," Dominey went on, standing before the window, his hands clasped behind his back, "that my wife from that moment developed a homicidal mania against me. I, who had fought in the most absolute self-defence. That was what drove me out of the country, Mangan. Not the fear of being arrested for having caused the death of Roger Unthank. I'd have stood my trial for that at any moment. It was the other thing that broke me up." "Quite so," Mangan murmured sympathetically. "As a matter of fact, you were perfectly safe from arrest, as it happened. The body of Roger Unthank has never been found from that day to this." "If it had?" "You must have been charged with either murder or manslaughter." Dominey abandoned his post at the window and raised his glass of sherry to his lips. The tragical side of these reminiscences seemed, so far as he was concerned, to have passed. "I suppose," he remarked, "it was the disappearance of the body which has given rise to all this talk as to his spirit still inhabiting the Black Wood." "Without a doubt," the lawyer acquiesced. "The place had a bad name already, as you know. As it is, I don't suppose there's a villager here who would cross the park in that direction after dark." Dominey glanced at his watch and led the way from the room. "After dinner," he promised, "I'll tell you a few West Africa superstitions which will make our local one seem anemic." Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of the Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 9. "I certainly offer you my heartiest congratulations upon your cellar, Sir Everard," his guest said as he sipped his third glass of port that evening. "This is the finest glass of '70 I've drunk for a long time. And this new fellow I've sent you down, Parkins, tells me there's any quantity of it." "It has had a pretty long rest," Dominey observed. "I was looking through the cellar book before dinner," the lawyer went on, "and I see that you still have 47 or 48, and a small quantity of 2 older vintages. Something ought to be done about those." "We will try one of them tomorrow night," Dominey suggested. We might spend half an hour or so in the cellars, if we have any time to spare." "And another half an hour," Mr. Mangan said gravely, "I should like to spend in interviewing Mrs. Unthank. Apart from any other question, I do not for one moment believe that she is the proper person to be entrusted with the care of Lady Dominey. I made up my mind to speak to you on this subject, Sir Everard, as soon as we had arrived here. Mrs. Unthank was old Mr. Felbrig's housekeeper, and my wife's nurse when she was a child," Dominey reminded his companions. "Whatever her faults may be, I believe she is devoted to Lady Dominey." "She may be devoted to your wife," the lawyer admitted, "but I am convinced that she is your enemy. The situation doesn't seem to me to be consistent. Mrs. Unthank is firmly convinced that, whether in fair fight or not, you killed her son. Lady Dominey believes that too, and it was the sight of you after the fight that sent her insane. I cannot but believe that it would be far better for Lady Dominey to have someone with her unconnected with this unfortunate chapter of your past." "We will consult Dr. Harrison tomorrow," Dominey said. "I am very glad you came down with me, Mangan," he went on, after a minute's hesitation. "I find it very difficult to get back into the atmosphere of those days. I even find it hard sometimes," he added, with a curious little glance across the table, "to believe that I am the same man." "Not so hard as I have done more than once," Mr. Mangan confessed. "Tell me exactly in what respects you consider me changed," Dominey insisted. "You seem to have lost a certain pliability, or perhaps I ought to call it looseness of disposition," he admitted. "There are many things connected with the past which I find it almost impossible to associate with you. For a trifling instance," he went on, with a slight smile, inclining his head towards his host's untasted glass, "you don't drink port like any Dominey I ever knew." "I'm afraid that I never acquired the taste for port," Dominey observed. The lawyer gazed at him with raised eyebrows. "Not acquired the taste for port," he repeated blankly. "I should have said reacquired," Dominey hastened to explain. "You see, in the bush we drank a simply frightful amount of spirits, and that vitiates the taste for all wine." The lawyer glanced enviously at his host's fine bronzed complexion and clear eyes. "You haven't the appearance of ever having drunk anything, Sir Everard," he observed frankly. "One finds it hard to believe the stories that were going about 10 or 15 years ago. The Dominey Constitution, I suppose?" The new butler entered the room noiselessly and came to his master's chair. "I have served coffee in the library, sir," he announced. "Mr. Middleton, the gamekeeper, has just called, and asked if he could have a word with you before he goes to bed tonight, sir. He seems in a very nervous and uneasy state." "He can come to the library at once," Dominey directed. "That is, if you are ready for your coffee, Mangan." "Indeed I am," the lawyer assented, rising. "A great treat, that wine. One thing that London restaurants can't give us. Port should never be drunk away from the place where it was laid down." The two men made their way across the very fine hall, the walls of which had suffered a little through lack of heating, into the library, and seated themselves in easy-chairs before the blazing log fire. Parkins silently served them with coffee and brandy. He had scarcely left the room before there was a timid knock, and Middleton made his somewhat hesitating entrance. "Come in and close the door," Dominey directed. "What is it, Middleton? Parkins says you wish to speak to me." The man came hesitatingly forward. He was obviously distressed and uneasy, and found speech difficult. His eyes glistened with the rain which had found its way, too, in long streaks down his velveteen coat. His white hair was wind-tossed and disarranged. "Bad night," Dominey remarked. "It's to save its being a worse one that I'm here, Squire," the old man replied hoarsely. "I've come to ask you a favour, and to beg you to grant it for your own sake. You'll not sleep in the oak room tonight?" "And why not?" Dominey asked. "It's next her ladyship's." "Well?" The old man was obviously perturbed, but his master, as though of a purpose, refused to help him. He glanced at Mangan and mumbled to himself. "Say exactly what you wish to, Middleton," Dominey invited. "Mr. Mangan and his father and grandfather have been solicitors to the estate for a great many years. They know all our family history, I can't get rightly in touch with you, Squire, and that's a fact," Middleton went on despairingly. "The shape of you seems larger and your voice harder. I don't seem to be so near to you as I'd wished, to say what's in my heart." "I have had a rough time, Middleton," Dominey reminded him. "No wonder I have changed. Never mind. Speak to me, just as man to man." "It was I who first met you, Squire," the old man went on, "when you tottered home that night across the park, with your arm hanging helplessly by your side, and the blood streaming down your face and clothes, and the red light in your eyes. Murderous fire, they called it. I heard her ladyship go into hysterics. I saw her laugh and sob like a maniac, and God help us, that's what she's been ever since." The two men were silent. Middleton had raised his voice, speaking with fierce excitement. It was obvious that he had only paused for breath. He had more to say. "I was by your side, Squire," he went on, "when her ladyship caught up the knife and ran at you, and as you well know, it was I, seizing her from behind, that saved a double tragedy that night. And it was I who went for the doctor the next morning, when she'd stolen into your room in the night and missed your throat by a bare inch. I heard her call to you, heard her threat. It was a madwoman's threat, Squire, but her ladyship is a madwoman at this moment, and with a knife in her hand you'll never be safe in this house." "We must see," Dominey said quietly, "that she is not allowed to get possession of any weapon." "I make sure of that," Middleton scoffed, "with Mother Unthank by her side. Her ladyship's mad because of the horror of that night, but Mother Unthank is mad with hate. And there isn't a week that passes," the old man went on, his voice dropping lower and his eyes burning, "that Roger Unthank's spirit don't come and howl for your blood beneath their window. If you stay here this night, Squire, come over and sleep in the little room they've got ready for you on the other side of the house." Mr. Mangan had lost his smooth after-dinner appearance. His face was rumpled and his coffee was growing cold. This was a very different thing from the vague letters and rumours which had reached him from time to time, and which he had put out of his mind with all the contempt of the materialist. "It is very good of you to warn me, Middleton," Dominey said. "But I can lock my door, can I not?" "Lock the door of the oak room?" was the scornful reply. "And what good would that do? You know well enough that the walls double on three sides, and there are more secret entrances than even I know of. The oak room's not right for you this night, Squire. It's hoping to get you there that's keeping them quiet." "Tell us what you mean, Middleton," the lawyer asked, with ill-assumed indifference, "when you spoke of the howling of Roger Unthank's spirit." The old man turned patiently around. "Just that, sir," he replied. "It's round the house most weeks. Except for me, odd nights, and Mrs. Unthank, there's been scarcely a servant would sleep in the hall for years. Some of the maids, they do come up from the village, but back they go before nightfall, and until morning there isn't a living soul who would cross the path. No, not for £100. "A howl, you call it," Mr. Mangan observed. "That's mostly like a dog that's hurt itself," Middleton explained equably. "Like a dog, that is, with a touch of human in its throat, as we've all heard in our time, sir. You'll hear it yourself, sir, maybe tonight or tomorrow night." "You've heard it then, Middleton?" his master asked. "Why, surely, sir," the old man replied in surprise. "Most weeks for the last 10 years." "Haven't you ever got up and gone out to see what it was?" The old man shook his head. "But I knew right well what that was, sir," he said, "and I'm not one for looking on spirits. Spirits there are that walk this world, as we well know, and the spirit of Roger Unthank walks from between the black wood and those windows come every week of the year. But I'm not for looking at him. There's evil comes of that. I turn over in my bed, and I stop my ears, but I've never yet raised a blind." "Tell me, Middleton," Dominey asked, "is Lady Dominey terrified at these visitations?" "That I can't rightly say, sir. Her ladyship's always sweet and gentle, with kind words on her lips for every one. But there's the terror in her eyes that was lit that night when you staggered into the hall, Squire, and I've never seen it properly quenched yet, so to speak. She carries fear with her, but whether it's the fear of seeing you again, or the fear of Roger Unthank's spirit, I could not tell." Dominey seemed suddenly to become possessed of a strange desire to thrust the whole subject away. He dismissed the old man kindly, but a little abruptly, accompanying him to the corridor which led to the servants' quarters, and talking all the time about the pheasants. When he returned, he found that his guest had emptied his second glass of brandy, and was surreptitiously mopping his forehead. "That," the latter remarked, "is the class of old retainer who lives too long. If I were a Dominey of the Middle Ages, I think a stone around his neck and the deepest well would be the sensible way of dealing with him. He made me feel positively uncomfortable." "I noticed it," Dominey remarked with a faint smile. "I'm not going to pretend that it was a pleasant conversation myself." "I've heard some ghost stories," Mangan went on, "but a spook that comes and howls once a week for 10 years takes some beating." Dominey poured himself out a glass of brandy with a steady hand. "You've been neglecting things here, Mangan," he complained. "You ought to have come down and exorcised that ghost. We shall have those smart maidservants of yours off tomorrow, I suppose, unless you and I can get a little ghost-laying in first." Mr. Mangan began to feel more comfortable. The brandy and the warmth of the burning logs were creeping into his system. "By the by, Sir Everard," he inquired, a little later on, "where are you going to sleep tonight?" Dominey stretched himself out composedly. "There is obviously only one place for me," he replied. "I can't disappoint anyone. I shall sleep in the oak room." Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 10. For the first few tangled moments of nightmare, slowly developing into a live horror, Dominey fancied himself back in Africa, with the hand of an enemy upon his throat. Then a rush of awakened memories, the silence of the great house, the mysterious rustling of the heavy hangings around the black oak four-poster on which he lay, the faint pricking of something deadly at his throat. These things rolled back the curtain of unreality, brought him acute and painful consciousness of a situation almost appalling. He opened his eyes, and although a brave and callous man, he lay still, paralyzed with the fear which forbids motion. The dim light of a candle, recently lit, flashed upon the bodkin-like dagger held at his throat. He gazed at the thin line of gleaming steel, fascinated. Already his skin had been broken. A few drops of blood were upon the collar of his pyjamas. The hand which held that deadly assailing weapon, small, slim, very feminine, curving from somewhere behind the bed curtain, belonged to some unseen person. He tried to shrink farther back upon the pillow. The hand followed him, displaying glimpses now of a soft, white-sleeved arm. He lay quite still, the muscles of his right arm growing tenser as he prepared for a snatch at those cruel fingers. Then a voice came, a slow, feminine, and rather wonderful voice. "If you move," it said, "you will die. Remain quite still." Dominey was fully conscious now, his brain at work, calculating his chances with all the cunning of the trained hunter who seeks to avoid death. Reluctantly he was compelled to realize that no movement of his could be quick enough to prevent the driving of that thin stiletto into his throat, if his hidden assailant should keep her word. So he lay still. "Why do you want to kill me?" he asked, a little tensely. There was no reply, yet somehow he knew that he was being watched. Ever so slightly those curtains around which the arm had come were being parted. Through the chink someone was looking at him. The thought came that he might call out for help, and once more his unseen enemy read his thought. "You must be very quiet," the voice said. That voice, which it was difficult for him to believe was not the voice of a child. "If you even speak above a whisper, it will be the end. I wish to look at you." A little wider the crack opened, and then he began to feel hope. The hand which held the stiletto was shaking. He heard something which sounded like quick breathing from behind the curtains. the breathing of a woman astonished or terrified, and then, so suddenly that for several seconds he could not move or take advantage of the circumstance, the hand with its cruel weapon was withdrawn around the curtain, and a woman began to laugh, softly at first, and then with a little hysterical sob thrusting its way through that incongruous note of mirth. He lay upon the bed as though mesmerized, finding at his first effort that his limbs refused their office, as might the limbs of one lying under the thrall of a nightmare. The laugh died away, there was a sound like a scraping upon the wall, the candle was suddenly blown out. Then his nerve began to return, and with it his control over his limbs. He crawled to the side of the bed remote from the curtains, stole to the little table on which he had left his revolver and an electric torch, snatched at them, and with the former in his right hand, flashed a little orb of light into the shadows of the great apartment. Once more something like terror seized him. The figure which had been standing by the side of the bed had vanished. There was no hiding place in view. Every inch of the room was lit up by the powerful torch he carried, and save for himself, the room was empty. The first moment of realization was chill and unnerving. Then the slight smarting of the wound at his throat became convincing proof to him that there was nothing supernatural about this visit. He lit up half a dozen of the candles distributed about the place and laid down his torch. He was ashamed to find that his forehead was dripping with perspiration. One of the secret passages, of course, he muttered to himself, stooping for a moment to examine the locked, folding doors which separated his room from the adjoining one. Perhaps, when one reflects, I have run unnecessary risks. Dominey was standing at the window, looking out at the tumbled grey waters of the North Sea, when Parkins brought him hot water and tea in the morning. He thrust his feet into slippers and held out his arms for a dressing gown. "Find out where the nearest bathroom is, Parkins," he ordered, "and prepare it. I have quite forgotten my way about here." "Very good, sir." The man was motionless for a moment, staring at the blood on his master's pyjamas. Dominey glanced down at it, and turned the dressing gown up to his throat. "I had a slight accident this morning," he remarked carelessly. "Any ghost alarms last night?" "None that I heard of, sir," the man replied. "I am afraid we should have difficulty in keeping the young women from London, if they heard what I heard the night of my arrival." "Very terrible, was it?" Dominey asked with a smile. Parkins' expression remained immovable. There was in his tone, however, a mute protest against his master's levity. "The cries were the most terrible I have ever heard, sir," he said. "I am not a nervous person, but I found them most disturbing." "Human or animal?" "A mixture of both, I should say, sir." "You should camp out for the night on the skirts of an African forest," Dominey remarked. "There you get a whole orchestra of wild animals, every one of them trying to freeze your blood up." "I was out in South Africa during the Boer War, sir," Parkins replied, "and I went big game hunting with my master afterwards. I do not think that any animal was ever born in Africa with so terrifying a cry as we heard the night before last." "We must look into the matter," Dominey muttered. "I have already prepared a bath, sir, at the end of the corridor," the man announced. "If you will allow me, I will show you the way." Dominey, when he descended about an hour later, found his guest awaiting him in the smaller dining room, which looked out eastwards towards the sea, a lofty apartment with great windows and with an air of faded splendour which came from the ill-cared-for tapestries hanging in places from the wall. Mr. Mangan had, contrary to his expectations, slept well and was in excellent spirits. The row of silver dishes upon the sideboard inspired him with an added cheerfulness. "So there were no ghosts walking last night?" he remarked as he took his place at the table. "Wonderful thing this absolute quiet is after London. Give you my word, I never heard a sound from the moment my head touched the pillow until I woke up a short while ago." Dominey returned from the sideboard, carrying also a well-filled plate. "I had a pretty useful night's rest myself," he observed. Mangan raised his eyeglass and gazed at his host's throat. "Cut yourself?" he queried. "Razor slip," Dominey told him. "You get out of the use of those things in Africa." "You've managed to give yourself a nasty gash," Mr. Mangan observed curiously. "Parkins is going to send up for a new set of safety razors for me," Dominey announced. "About our plans for the day. I've ordered the car for 2:30 this afternoon, if that suits you. We can look around the place quietly this morning. Mr. Johnson is sleeping over at a farmhouse near here. We shall pick him up en route, and I have told Leaves, the bailiff, to come with us too." Mr. Mangan nodded his approval. "Upon my word," he confessed, "it will be a joy for me to go and see some of these fellows without having to put 'em off about repairs and that sort of thing. Johnson has had the worst of it, poor chap, but there are one or two of them took it into their heads to come up to London and worry me at the office. I intend that there shall be no more dissatisfaction amongst my tenants." Mr. Mangan set off for another prowl towards the sideboard. "Satisfied tenants you never will get in Norfolk," he declared. "I must admit, though, that some of them have had cause to grumble lately. There's a fellow round by Wells who farms nearly 800 acres." He broke off in his speech. There was a knock at the door, not an ordinary knock at all, but a measured, deliberate tapping, 3 times, repeated. "Come in," Dominey called out. Mrs. Unthank entered, severer, more unattractive than ever in the hard morning light. She came to the end of the table facing the place where Dominey was seated. "Good morning, Mrs. Unthank," he said. She ignored the greeting. "I am the bearer of a message," she announced. "Pray deliver it," Dominey replied. "Her ladyship would be glad for you to visit her in her apartment at once." Dominey leaned back in his chair. His eyes were fixed upon the face of the woman whose antagonism to himself was so apparent. She stood in the path of a long gleam of morning sunlight. The wrinkles in her face, her hard mouth, her cold, steely eyes were all clearly revealed. "I am not at all sure," he said with a purpose in his words, "that any further meeting between Lady Dominey and myself is at present desirable." If he had thought to disturb this messenger by his suggestion, he was disappointed. "Her ladyship desires me to assure you," she added, with a note of contempt in her tone, "that you need be under no apprehension." Dominey admitted defeat, and poured himself out some more coffee. Neither of the two noticed that his fingers were trembling. "Her ladyship is very considerate," he said. "Kindly say that I shall follow you in a few minutes." Dominey, following within a very few minutes of his summons, was ushered into an apartment large and sombrely elegant, an apartment of faded white and gold walls, of chandeliers glittering with lustres, of Louis Quinze furniture, shabby but priceless. To his surprise, although he scarcely noticed it at the time, Mrs. Unthank promptly disappeared. He was from the first left alone with the woman whom he had come to visit. She was sitting up on her couch and watching his approach. A woman? Surely only a child, with pale cheeks, large, anxious eyes, and masses of brown hair brushed back from her forehead. After all, was he indeed a strong man, vowed to great things? There was a queer feeling in his throat, almost a mist before his eyes. She seemed so fragile, so utterly, sweetly pathetic. And all the time there was that strange light, or was it want of light, in those haunting eyes? His speech of greeting was never spoken. "So you have come to see me, Everard," she said in a broken tone. "You are very brave." He possessed himself of her hand, the hand which a few hours ago had held a dagger to his throat, and kissed the waxen-like figures. It fell to her side like a lifeless thing. Then she raised it and began rubbing softly at the place where his lips had fallen. "I have come to see you at your bidding," he replied, "and for my pleasure." "Pleasure!" she murmured, with a ghastly little smile. "You have learnt to control your words, Everard. You have slept here, and you live. I have broken my word. I wonder why?" "Because," he pleaded, "I have not deserved that you should seek my life." "That sounds strangely," she reflected. "Doesn't it say somewhere in the Bible, 'A life for a life'? You killed Roger Unthank." "I have killed other men since in self-defence," Dominey told her. "Sometimes it comes to a man that he must slay or be slain. It was Roger Unthank. I shall not talk about him any longer," she decided quite calmly. "The night before last his spirit was calling to me below my window. He wants me to go down into hell and live with him. The very thought is horrible." "Come," Dominey said, "we shall speak of other things. You must tell me what presents I can buy you. I have come back from Africa rich." "Presents?" For a single wonderful moment hers was the face of a child who had been offered toys. Her smile of anticipation was delightful. Her eyes had lost that strange vacancy. Then before he could say another word, it all came back again. "Listen to me," she said. "This is important. I have sent for you because I do not understand why, quite suddenly last night, after I had made up my mind, I lost the desire to kill you. It is gone now. I am not sure about myself any longer. Draw your chair nearer to mine, or no, come to my side, here at the other end of the sofa." She moved her skirts to make room for him. When he sat down, he felt a strange trembling through all his limbs. "Perhaps," she went on, "I shall break my oath. Indeed, I have already broken it. Let me look at you, my husband. It is a strange thing to own after all these years. A husband." Dominey felt as though he were breathing an atmosphere of turgid and poisoned sweetness. There was a flavour of unreality about the whole situation. The room, this child woman, her beauty, her deliberate, halting speech, and the strange things she said. "You find me changed?" he asked. "You are wonderfully changed. You look stronger, you are perhaps better looking, yet there is something gone from your face which I thought one never lost." "You," he said cautiously, "are more beautiful than ever, Rosamund." She laughed a little drearily. "Of what use has my beauty been to me, Everard, since you came to my little cottage and loved me and made me love you, and took me away from Dar Roger? Do you remember the school children used to call him Dar Roger? But that does not matter. Do you know, Everard, that since you left me my feet have not passed outside these gardens?" "That can be altered when you wish," he said quickly. "You can visit where you will. You can have a motor car, even a house in town. I shall bring some wonderful doctors here, and they will make you quite strong again." Her large eyes were lifted almost piteously to his. "But how can I leave here?" she asked plaintively. "Every week, sometimes oftener, he calls to me. If I went away, his spirit would break loose and follow me. I must be here to wave my hand. Then he goes away." Dominey was conscious once more of that strange and most unexpected fit of emotion. He was unrecognizable even to himself. Never before in his life had his heart beaten as it was beating now. His eyes, too, were hot. He had travelled around the world in search of new things, only to find them in this strange, fated chamber, side by side with this suffering woman. Nevertheless, he said quietly, "We must send you some place where the people are kinder and where life is pleasanter. Perhaps you love music and to see beautiful pictures. I think that we must try and keep you from thinking." She sighed in a perplexed fashion. "I wish that I could get it out of my blood that I want to kill you. Then you could take me right away. Other married people have lived together and hated each other. Why shouldn't we? We may forget even to hate." Dominey staggered to his feet, walked to a window, threw it open, and leaned out for a moment. Then he closed it and came back. This new element in the situation had been a shock to him. All the time she was watching him composedly. "Well," she asked with a strange little smile, "what do you say? Would you like to hold as a wife's the hand which frightened you so last night?" She held it out to him, soft and warm. Her fingers even returned the pressure of his. She looked at him pleasantly, and once more he felt like a man who has wandered into a strange country and has lost his bearings. "I want you so much to be happy," he said hoarsely. "But you are not strong yet, Rosamund. We cannot decide anything in a hurry." "How surprised you are to find that I am willing to be nice to you," she murmured. "But why not? You cannot know why I have so suddenly changed my mind about you, and I have changed it. I have seen the truth these few minutes. There is a reason, Everard, why I should not kill you." "What is it?" he demanded. She shook her head with all the joy of a child who keeps a secret. "You are clever," she said. "I will leave you to find it out. I am excited now, and I want you to go away for a little time. Please send Mrs. Unthank to me." The prospect of release was a strange relief, mingled still more strangely with regret. He lingered over her hand. "If you walk in your sleep tonight, then," he begged, "you will leave your dagger behind?" "I have told you," she answered, as though surprised, "that I have abandoned my intention. I shall not kill you, even though I may walk in my sleep, and sometimes the nights are so long. It will not be your death I seek." End of Chapter 10. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 11 of the Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 11. Dominey left the room like a man in a dream, descended the stairs to his own part of the house, caught up a hat and stick, and strode out into the sea mist which was fast enveloping the gardens. There was all the chill of the North Pole in that ice-cold cloud of vapour, but nevertheless his forehead remained hot, his pulses burning. He passed out the postern gate which led from the walled garden on to a broad marsh, with dikes running here and there, and lapping tongues of sea-water creeping in with the tide. He made his way seaward with uncertain steps until he reached a rough and stony road. Here he hesitated for a moment, looked about him, and then turned back at right angles. Soon he came to a little village, a village of ancient cottages, with seasoned red brick tiles, trim little patches of garden, a church embowered with tall elm trees, a triangular green at the cross-roads. On one side a low thatched building, the Dominey Arms, on another an ancient square stone house on which was a brass plate. He went over and read the name, rang the bell, and asked the trim maidservant who answered it for the doctor. Presently a man of youthful middle age presented himself in the surgery and bowed. Dominey was for a moment at a loss. "I came to see Dr. Harrison," he ventured. "Dr. Harrison retired from practice some years ago," was the courteous reply. "I am his nephew. My name is Stillwell." "I understood that Dr. Harrison was still in the neighbourhood," Dominey said. "My name is Dominey, Sir Everard Dominey." "I guessed as much," the other replied. "My uncle lives with me here, and to tell you the truth, he was hoping that you would come and see him. He retains one patient only," Dr. Stillwell added in a graver tone. "You can imagine who that would be." His caller bowed. "Lady Dominey, I presume." The young doctor opened the door and motioned to his guest to precede him. "My uncle has his own little apartment on the other side of the house," he said. "You must let me take you to him." They moved across the pleasant white stone hall into a small apartment with French windows leading out to a flagged terrace and tennis lawn. An elderly man, broad-shouldered, with weather-beaten face, grey hair, and of somewhat serious aspect, looked around from the window before which he was standing examining a case of fishing flies. "Uncle, I have brought an old friend in to see you," his nephew announced. The doctor glanced expectantly at Dominey, half moved forward as though to greet him, then checked himself and shook his head doubtfully. "You certainly remind me very much of an old friend, sir," he said, "but I can see now that you are not he. I do not believe that I have ever seen you before in my life." There was a moment's somewhat tense silence. Then Dominey advanced a little stiffly and held out his hand. "Come, doctor," he said, "I can scarcely have changed as much as all that, even these years of strenuous life." "You mean to tell me that I am speaking to Everard Dominey?" the doctor interposed. "Without a doubt." The doctor shook hands coolly. His was certainly not the enthusiastic welcome of an old family attendant to the representative of a great family. "I should certainly never have recognized you," he confessed. "My presence here is nevertheless indisputable," Dominey continued. "Still attracted by your old pastime, I see, doctor." "I have only taken up fly fishing," the other replied dryly, "since I gave up shooting. There was another somewhat awkward pause, which the younger man endeavoured to bridge over. "Fishing, shooting, golf," he said. "I really don't know what we poor medical practitioners would do in the country without sport." "I shall remind you of that later," Dominey observed. "I am told that the shooting is one of the only glories that has not passed away from Dominey." "I shall look forward to the reminder," was the prompt response. His uncle, who had been bending once more over the case of flies, turned abruptly around. "Arthur," he said, addressing his nephew, "you had better start on your round. I dare say Sir Everard would like to speak to me privately." "I wish to speak to you, certainly," Dominey admitted, "but only professionally. There is no necessity." "I am late already, if you will excuse me," Dr. Stillwell interrupted. "I will be getting on. You must excuse my uncle, Sir Everard," he added in a lower tone, drawing him a little towards the door, "if his manners are a little gruff. He is devoted to Lady Dominey, and I sometimes think that he broods over her case too much." Dominey nodded and turned back into the room to find the doctor, his hands in his old-fashioned breeches pockets, eyeing him steadfastly. "I find it very hard to believe," he said a little curtly, "that you are really Everard Dominey." "I am afraid you will have to accept me as a fact, nevertheless." "Your present appearance," the old man continued, eyeing him appraisingly, "does not in any way bear out the description I had of you some years ago. I was told that you had become a broken-down drunkard." "The world is full of liars," Dominey said equably. "You appear to have met with one at least." "You have not even," the doctor persisted, "the appearance of a man who has been used to excesses of any sort." "Good old stock hours," his visitor observed carelessly. "Plenty of two-bottle men behind my generation." "You have also gained courage since the days when you fled from England. You slept at the Hall last night?" "Where else? I also, if you want to know, occupied my own bedchamber. With results," Dominey added, throwing his head back a little to display the scar on his throat, "altogether insignificant." "That's just your luck," the doctor declared. "You've no right to have gone there without seeing me. No right, after all that has passed, to have even approached your wife." "You seem rather a martinet as regards my domestic affairs," Dominey observed. "That's because I know your history," was the blunt reply. Uninvited, Dominey seated himself in an easy-chair. "You never were my friend, Doctor," he said. "Let me suggest that we conduct this conversation on a purely professional basis." "I was never your friend," came the retort, "because I have known you always as a selfish brute, because you were married to the sweetest woman on God's earth, gave up none of your bad habits, frightened her into insanity by reeling home with another man's blood on your hands, and then stayed away for over 10 years instead of making an effort to repair the mischief you had done." "This," observed Dominey, "is history, dished up in a somewhat partial fashion. I repeat my suggestion that we confine our conversation to the professional." "This is my house," the other rejoined, "and you came to see me. I shall say exactly what I like to you, and if you don't like it, you can get out. If it weren't for Lady Dominey's sake, you shouldn't have passed this threshold." "Then for her sake," Dominey suggested in a softer tone, "can't you forget how thoroughly you disapprove of me? I am here now with only one object. I want you to point out to me any way in which we can work together for the improvement of my wife's health." "There can be no question of a partnership between us." "You refuse to help?" "My help isn't worth a snap of the fingers. I have done all I can for her physically. She is a perfectly sound woman. The rest depends upon you and you alone, and I am not very hopeful about it." "Upon me?" Dominey repeated, a little taken aback. "Fidelity," the doctor grunted, "is second nature with all good women. Lady Dominey is a good woman, and she is no exception to the rule. Her brain is starved because her heart is aching for love. If she could believe in your repentance and reform, if any atonement for the past were possible and were generously offered, I cannot tell what the result might be. They tell me that you are a rich man now, although heaven knows when one considers what a lazy, selfish fellow you were, that sounds like a miracle. You could have the great specialists down. They couldn't help, but it might solve your conscience to pay them a few hundred guineas." "Would you meet them?" Dominey asked anxiously. Tell me whom to send for." "Pooh! Those days are finished with me," was the curt reply. "I would meet none of them. I am a doctor no longer. I have become a villager. I go to see Lady Dominey as an old friend." "Give me your advice," Dominey begged. "Is it of any use sending for specialists?" "Just for the present, none at all." "And what about that horrible woman, Mrs. Unthank?" "Part of your task, if you are really going to take it up. She stands between your wife and the son." "Then why have you suffered her to remain there all those years?" Dominey demanded. "For one thing, because there has been no one to replace her," the doctor replied. "And for another, because Lady Dominey, believing that you slew her son, has some fantastic idea of giving her a home and shelter as a kind of expiation." "You think there is no affection between the two?" Dominey asked. "Not a scrap," was the blunt reply, "except that Lady Dominey is of so sweet and gentle a nature." The doctor paused abruptly. His visitor's fingers had strayed across his throat. "That's a different matter," the former continued fiercely. "That's just where the weak spot in her brain remains. If you ask me, I believe it's pandered to by Mrs. Unthank. Come to think of it," he went on, "the Domineys were never cowards. If you've got your courage back, send Mrs. Unthank away, sleep with your doors wide open. If a single night passes without Lady Dominey coming to your room with a knife in her hand, she will be cured in time of that mania, at any rate. Dare you do that?" Dominey's hesitation was palpable, also his agitation. The doctor grinned contemptuously. "Still afraid," he scoffed. "Not in the way you imagine," his visitor replied. "My wife has already promised to make no further attempt upon my life." "Well, you can cure her if you want to," the doctor declared. "And if you do, you will have the sweetest companion for life any man could have. But you'll have to give up the idea of town houses, and racing and yachting, and grouse moors in Scotland, and all those sorts of things I suppose you've been looking forward to. You'll have, for some time at any rate, to give every moment of your time to your wife." Dominey moved uneasily in his chair. "For the next few months," he said, "that would be impossible." "Impossible?" The doctor repeated the word, seemed to roll it round in his mouth with a sort of wondering scorn. "I am not quite the idler I used to be," Dominey explained, frowning. "Nowadays you cannot make money without assuming responsibilities. I am clearing off the whole of the mortgages upon the Dominey estates within the next few months." "How you spend your time is your affair, not mine," the doctor muttered. "All I say about the matter is that your wife's cure, if ever it comes to pass, is in your hands. And now, come over to me here, in the light of this window. I want to look at you." Dominey obeyed with a little shrug of the shoulders. There was no sunshine, but the white north light was, in its way, searching. It showed the sprinkling of grey in his ruddy brown hair, the suspicion of it in his closely trimmed moustache, but it could find no weak spot in his steady eyes, in the tan of his hard, manly complexion, or even in the set of his somewhat arrogant lips. The old doctor took up his box of flies again and jerked his head towards the door. "You are a miracle," he said, "and I hate miracles. I'll come and see Lady Dominey in a day or so." End of Chapter 11. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 12 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 12. Dominey spent a curiously placid, and to those with whom he was brought into contact, an entirely satisfactory afternoon. With Mr. Mangan by his side, murmuring amiable platitudes, and Mr. Johnson, his agent opposite, revelling in the unusual situation of a satisfied landlord and delighted tenants, he made practically the entire round of the Dominey estates. They reached home late, but Dominey, although he seemed to be living in another world, was not neglectful of the claims of hospitality. Probably for the first time in their lives, Mr. Johnson and Lees, the bailiff, watched the opening of a magnum of champagne. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat as he raised his glass. "It isn't only on my own account, Sir Everard," he said, "that I drink your hearty good health. I have your tenants, too, in my mind. They've had a rough time, some of them, and they've stood it like white men. So here's from them and me to you, sir, and may we see plenty of you in these parts." Mr. Lees associated himself with these sentiments, and the glasses were speedily emptied and filled again. "I suppose you know, Sir Everard," the agent observed, "that what you've promised to-day will cost a matter of £10,000 to £15,000. Dominey nodded. "Before I go to bed to-night," he said, "I shall send a cheque for £20,000 to the estate account at your bank at Wells. The money is there waiting, put aside for just that one purpose, and, well, you may just as well have it." Agent and bailiff leaned back in their tonneau of their motor car half an hour later, with immense cigars in their mouths and a pleasant, rippling warmth in their veins. They had the sense of having drifted into fairyland. Their philosophy, however, met the situation. "It's a fair miracle," Mr. Lees declared. "A modern romance," Mr. Johnson, who read novels, murmured. "Hello, here's a visitor for the Hall," he added, as a car swept by them. "Comfortable-looking gent, too," Mr. Lees remarked. The comfortable-looking gent was Otto Seaman, who presented himself at the Hall with a small dressing-bag and a great many apologies. "Found myself in Norwich, Sir Everard," he explained. "I have done business there all my life, and one of my customers needed looking after. I finished early, and when I found that I was only 30 miles off you, I couldn't resist having a run across. If it is in any way inconvenient to put me up for the night, say so." "My dear fellow," Dominey interrupted, "there are a score of rooms ready. All that we need is to light a fire, and an old-fashioned bed-warmer will do the rest. You remember Mr. Mangan?" The two men shook hands, and Seaman accepted a little refreshment after his drive. He lingered behind for a moment after the dressing-bell had rung. "What time is that fellow going?" he asked. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," Dominey replied. "Not a word until then," Seaman whispered back. "I must not seem to be hanging after you too much. I really did not want to come, but the matter is urgent." "We can send Mangan to bed early," Dominey suggested. "I am the early bird myself," was the weary reply. "I was up all last night. Tomorrow morning will do." Dinner that night was a pleasant and social meal. Mr. Mangan especially was uplifted. Everything to do with the Domineys for the last 15 years had reeked of poverty. He had really had a hard struggle to make both ends meet. There had been disagreeable interviews with angry tenants, formal interviews with dissatisfied mortgagees, and remarkably little profit at the end of the year to set against these disagreeable episodes. The new situation was almost beatific. The concluding touch, perhaps, was in Parkins' congratulatory whispers as he set a couple of decanters upon the table. "I have found a bin of Cockburn's '51, sir," he announced, including the lawyer in his confidential whisper. "I thought you might like to try a couple of bottles, as Mr. Mangan seems rather a connoisseur, sir. The corks appear to be in excellent condition." After this, Mangan sighed, it will be hard to get back to the austere life of a Pall Mall club. Seaman, very early in the evening, pleaded an extraordinary sleepiness and retired, leaving his host and Mangan alone over the port. Dominey, although an attentive host, seemed a little abstracted. Even Mr. Mangan, who was not an observant man, was conscious that a certain hardness, almost arrogance of speech and manner, seemed temporarily to have left his patron. "I can't tell you, Sir Everard," he said, as he sipped his first glass of wine, "what a pleasure it is to me to see, as it were, this recrudescence of an old family. If I might be allowed to say so, there's only one thing necessary to round the whole business off, as it were." "And that?" Dominey asked unthinkingly. "The return of Lady Dominey to health. I was one of the few, you may remember, privileged to make her acquaintance at the time of your marriage." "I paid a visit this morning," Dominey said, "to the doctor who has been in attendance upon her since her marriage. He agrees with me that there is no reason why Lady Dominey should not, in the course of time, be restored to perfect health." "I take the liberty of finishing my glass to that hope, Sir Everard," the lawyer murmured. Both glasses were set down empty, only the stem of Dominey's was snapped in two. Mr. Mangan expressed his polite regrets. This old glass," he murmured, looking at his own admiringly, "becomes very fragile." Dominey did not answer. His brain had served him a strange trick. In the shadows of the room he had fancied that he could see Stephanie Eiderstrom holding out her arms, calling to him to fulfil the pledges of long ago. And behind her— "Have you ever been in love, Mangan?" Dominey asked his companion. "I, sir? Well, I'm not sure," the man of the world replied, a little startled by the abruptness of the question. "It's an old-fashioned way of looking at things now, isn't it?" Dominey relapsed into thoughtfulness. "I suppose so," he admitted. That night a storm rolled up from somewhere across that grey waste of waters, a storm heralded by a wind which came booming over the marshes, shaking the latticed windows of Dominey Place, shrieking and wailing amongst its chimneys and around its many corners. Black clouds leaned over the land, and drenching streams of rain dashed against the loose-framed sashes of the windows. Dominey lit the tall candles in his bedroom, fastened a dressing-gown around him, threw himself into an easy-chair, and fixing an electric reading lamp by his side, tried to read. Very soon the book slipped from his fingers. He became suddenly tense and watchful. His eyes counted one by one the panels in the wall by the left-hand side of the bed. The familiar click was twice repeated. For a moment a dark space appeared. Then a woman, stooping low, glided into the room. She came slowly towards him, drawn like a moth towards that semicircle of candle. Her hair hung down her back like a girl's, and the white dressing-gown which floated diaphanously about her was unexpectedly reminiscent of Bond Street. "You are not afraid?" she asked anxiously. "See, I have nothing in my hands. I almost think that the desire has gone. You remember the little stiletto I had last night? Today I threw it into the well. Mrs. Unthank was very angry with me." "I am not afraid," he assured her. "But—" "Ah, but you will not scold me," she begged. "It is the storm which terrifies me." He drew a low chair for her into the little circle of light and arranged some cushions. As she sank into it, she suddenly looked up at him and smiled, a smile of rare and wonderful beauty. Dominey felt for a moment something like the stab of a knife at his heart. "Sit here and rest," he invited. "There is nothing to fear." "In my heart I know that," she answered simply. "These storms are part of our lives. They come with birth and they shake the world when death seizes us. One should never be afraid. But I have been so ill, Everard. Shall I call you Everard still?" "Why not?" he asked. "Because you are not like Everard to me any more," she told him. "Because something has gone from you, and something has come to you. You are not the same man. What is it? Had you troubles in Africa? Did you learn what life was like out there?" He sat looking at her for a moment, leaning back in his chair, which he had pushed a few feet into the shadows. Her hair was glossy and splendid, and against it her skin seemed whiter and more delicate than ever. Her eyes were lustrous but plaintive, and with something of the child's fear of harm in them. She looked very young and very fragile to have been swayed through the years by an evil passion. "I learnt many things there, Rosamund," he told her quietly. "I learnt a little of the difference between right doing and wrong doing. I learnt, too, that all the passions of life burn themselves out, save one alone." She twisted the girdle of her dressing-gown in her fingers for a moment. His last speech seemed to have been outside the orbit of her comprehension or interest. "You need not be afraid of me any more, Everard," she said, a little pathetically. "I have no fear of you," he answered. "Then why don't you bring your chair forward and come and sit a little nearer to me?" she asked, raising her eyes. "Do you hear the wind? How it shrieks at us? Oh, I am afraid." He moved forward to her side and took her hand gently in his. Her fingers responded at once to his pressure. When he spoke, he scarcely recognized his own voice. It seemed to him thick and choked. "The wind shall not hurt you or anything else," he promised. "I have come back to take care of you." She sighed, smiled like a tired child, and her eyes closed as her head fell farther back amongst the cushions. "Stay just like that, please," she begged. Something quite new is coming to me. I am resting. It is the sweetest rest I have ever felt. Don't move, Everard. Let my fingers stay in yours, so." The candles burned down in their sockets. The wind rose to greater furies, and died away only as the dawn broke through the storm clouds. A pale light stole into the room. Still the woman slept, and still her fingers seemed to keep their clutch upon his hand. Her breathing was all the time soft and regular. Her silky black eyelashes lay motionless upon her pale cheeks. Her mouth, a very perfectly shaped mouth, rested in quiet lines. Somehow he realized that about this slumber there was a new thing. With hot eyes and aching limbs he sat through the night. Dream after dream rose up and passed away before that little background of tapestried wall. When she opened her eyes and looked at him, the same smile parted her lips as the smile which had come there when she had passed away to sleep. "I am so rested," she murmured. "I feel so well. I have had dreams, beautiful dreams." The fire had burned out, and the room was chilly. "You must go back to your room now," he said. Very slowly her fingers relaxed. She held out her arms. "Carry me," she begged. "I am only half awake. I want to sleep again." He lifted her up. Her fingers closed around his neck. Her head fell back with a little sigh of content. He tried the folding doors, and finding some difficulty in opening them, carried her out into the corridor, into her own room, and laid her upon the untouched bed. "You are quite comfortable?" he asked. "Quite," she murmured drowsily. "Kiss me, Everard." Her hands drew his face down. His lips rested upon her forehead. Then he drew the bedclothes over her and fled. End of Chapter 12. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 13 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 13. There was a cloud on Seaman's good-humoured face as, muffled up in their overcoats, he and his host walked up and down the terrace the next morning, after the departure of Mr. Mangan. He disclosed his mind a little abruptly. "In a few minutes," he said, "I shall come to the great purpose of my visit. I have great and wonderful news for you, but it will keep." "The time for action has arrived?" Dominey asked curiously. "I hope you will remember that as yet I am scarcely established here." "It is with regard to your establishment here," Seaman explained dryly, "that I desire to say a word. We have seen much of one another since we met in Cape Town. The passion and purpose of my life you have been able to judge. Of those interludes which are necessary to a human being, unless his system is to fall to pieces as dry dust, you have also seen something. I trust you will not misunderstand me when I say that apart from the necessities of my work, I am a man of sentiment." "I am prepared to admit it," Dominey murmured a little idly. "You have undertaken a great enterprise. It was, without a doubt, a miraculous piece of fortune which brought the Englishman, Dominey, to your camp just at the moment when you received your orders from headquarters. Your self-conceived plan has met with every encouragement from us. You will be placed in a unique position to achieve your final purpose. Now, mark my words, and do not misunderstand me. The very keynote of our progress is ruthlessness. To take even a single step forward towards the achievement of that purpose is worth the sacrifice of all the scruples and delicacies conceivable. But when a certain course of action is without profit to our purpose, I see ugliness in it. It distresses me." "What the devil do you mean?" Dominey demanded. "I sleep with one ear open," Seaman replied. "Well?" "I saw you leave your room early this morning," Seaman continued, "carrying Lady Dominey in your arms." There were little streaks of pallor underneath the tan in Dominey's face. His eyes were like glittering metal. It was only when he had breathed once or twice quickly that he could command his voice. "What concern is this of yours?" he demanded. Seaman gripped his companion's arm. "Look here," he said, "we are too closely allied for bluff. I am here to help you fill the shoes of another man, so far as regards his estates, his position, and character, which, by the by, you are rehabilitating. I will go further. I will admit that it is not my concern to interfere in any ordinary amour you might undertake, but I shall tell you this, my friend, to your face, that to deceive a lady of weak intellect, however beautiful, to make use of your position as her supposed husband, is not, save in the vital interest of his country, the action of a Prussian nobleman." Dominey's passion seemed to have burned itself out without expression. He showed not the slightest resentment at his companion's words. "Have no fear, Seaman," he enjoined him. "The situation is delicate, but I can deal with it as a man of honour." "You relieve me," Seaman confessed. "You must admit that the spectacle of last night was calculated to inspire me with uneasiness." "I respect you for your plain words," Dominey declared. "The fact is, that Lady Dominey was frightened of the storm last night and found her way into my room. You may be sure that I treated her with all the respect and sympathy which our positions demanded." "Lady Dominey," Seaman remarked meditatively, "seems to be curiously falsifying certain predictions." "In what way?" "The common impression in the neighbourhood here is that she is a maniac chiefly upon one subject, her detestation of you. She has been known to take an oath that you should die if you slept in this house again. You, naturally, being a brave man, ignored all this, yet in the morning, after your first night here, there was blood upon your night clothes." Dominey's eyebrows were slowly raised. "You are well served here," he observed, with involuntary sarcasm. "That, for your own sake as well as ours, is necessary," was the terse reply. To continue, people of unsound mind are remarkably tenacious of their ideas. There was certainly nothing of the murderess in her demeanour towards you last night. Cannot you see that a too friendly attitude on her part might become fatal to our schemes?" "In what way?" "If ever your identity is doubted," Seaman explained, "the probability of which is, I must confess, becoming less every day, the fact that Lady Dominey seems to have so soon forgot all her enmity towards you would be strong presumptive evidence that you are not the man you claim to be." "Ingenious," Dominey assented, "and very possible. All this time, however, we speak on what you yourself admit to be a side issue." "You are right," Seaman confessed. "Very well, then, listen. A great moment has arrived for you, my friend." "Explain, if you please." "I shall do so. You have seen proof during the last few days that you have an organisation behind you to whom money is dross. It is the same in diplomacy as in war. Germany will pay the price for what she intends to achieve. £90,000 was yesterday passed to the credit of your account for the extinction of certain mortgages. In a few months or a few years' time, some distant Dominey will benefit to that extent. We cannot recover the money. It is just an item in our day-by-day expenses." "It was certainly a magnificent way of establishing me," Dominey admitted. "Magnificent, but safest in the long run," Seaman declared. "If you had returned a poor man, everybody's hand would have been against you. Suspicions, now absolutely unkindled, might have been formed, and more important, perhaps, than either, you would have not been able to take your place in society, which is absolutely necessary for the furtherance of our scheme." "Is it not almost time," Dominey enquired, "that the way was made a little clearer for me?" "That would have been my task this morning," Seaman replied, "but for the news I bring. In passing, however, let me promise you this. You will never be asked to stoop to the crooked ways of the ordinary spy. We want you for a different purpose." "And the news? What must be the greatest desire in your heart," Seaman said solemnly, "is to be granted. The Kaiser has expressed a desire to see you, to give you his instructions in person." Dominey stopped short upon the terrace. He withdrew his arm from his companion's and stared at him blankly. "The Kaiser?" he exclaimed. "You mean that I am to go to Germany?" "We shall start at once," Seaman replied. "Personally, I do not consider the proceeding discreet or necessary. It has been decided upon, however, without consulting me." "I consider it suicidal," Dominey protested. "What explanation can I possibly make for going to Germany of all the countries in the world before I have had time to settle down here?" "That of itself will not be difficult," his companion pointed out. "Many of the mines in which a share has been bought in your name are being run with German capital. It is easy to imagine that a crisis has arisen in the management of one of them. We require the votes of your fellow shareholders. You need not trouble your head about that. And think of the wonder of it! If only for a single day your sentence of banishment is lifted, you will breathe the air of the fatherland once more." "It will be wonderful," Dominey muttered. "It will be for you," Seaman promised, "a breath of the things that are to come. And now, action. How I love action! That timetable, my friend, and your chauffeur." It was arranged that the two men should leave during the morning for Norwich by motor car and thence to Harwich. Dominey, having changed into travelling clothes, sent a messenger for Mrs. Unthank, who came to him presently in his study. He held out a chair to her, which she declined, however, to take. "Mrs. Unthank," he said, "I should like to know why you have been content to remain my wife's attendant for the last 10 years." Mrs. Unthank was startled by the suddenness of the attack. "Lady Dominey has needed me," she answered after a moment's pause. "Do you consider," he asked, "that you have been the best possible companion for her?" "She has never been willing to accept any other," the woman replied. "Are you very devoted to my wife?" he enquired. Mrs. Unthank, grim and fierce though she was and appeared to be, was obviously disconcerted by Dominey's line of questions. "If I weren't," she demanded, "should I have been here all these years? I scarcely see," he continued, "what particular claim my wife has had upon you. I understand, moreover, that you are one of those who firmly believe that I killed your son. Is this attendance upon my wife a Christian act, then? The returning of good for evil?" "Exactly what do you want to say to me, Sir Everard?" she asked harshly. "I wish to say this," Dominey replied, "that I am determined to bring about my wife's restoration to health. For that reason I am going to have specialists down here, and above all things to change for a time her place of residence. My own feeling is that she will stand a much better chance of recovery without your attendance." "You dare to send me away?" the woman demanded. "That is my intention," Dominey confessed. "I have not spoken to Lady Dominey yet, but I hope that very soon my influence over her will be such that she will be content to obey my wishes. I look upon your future from the financial point of view as my care. I shall settle upon you the sum of £300 a year." The woman showed her first sign of weakness. She began to shake. There was a curious look of fear in her eyes. "I can't leave this place, Sir Everard," she cried. "I must stay here." "Why?" he demanded. "Lady Dominey couldn't do without me," she answered sullenly. "That," he replied, "is for her to decide. Personally, from enquiries I have made, I believe that you have encouraged in her that ridiculous superstition about the ghost of your son. I also believe that you have kept alive in her that spirit of unreasonable hatred which she has felt towards me." "Unreasonable, you call it?" the woman almost shouted. "You, who came home to her with the blood on your hands of the man whom, if only you had kept away, she might one day have loved. Unreasonable, you call it?" "I have finished what I had to say, Mrs. Unthank," Dominey declared. "I am compelled by important business to leave here for 2 or 3 days. On my return I shall embark upon the changes with which I have acquainted you. In the meantime," he added, watching a curious change in the woman's expression, "I have written this morning to Doctor Harrison, asking him to come up this afternoon and to keep Lady Dominey under his personal observation until my return." She stood quite still, looking at him. Then she came a little nearer and leaned forward, as though studying his face. "11 years," she muttered, "do change many men. but I never knew a man made out of a weakling." "I have nothing more to say to you," Dominey replied, "except to let you know that I am coming to see my wife in the space of a few minutes." The motor horn was already sounding below when Dominey was admitted to his wife's apartment. She was dressed in a loose gown of a warm crimson colour, and she had the air of one awaiting his arrival expectantly. The passion of hatred seemed to have passed from her pale face and from the depths of her strangely soft eyes. She held out her hands toward him. Her brows were a little puckered. The disappointment of a child lurked in her manner. "You are going away?" she murmured. "In a very few moments," he told her. "I have been waiting to see you for an hour." She made a grimace. "It was Mrs. Unthank. I think that she hid my things on purpose. I was so anxious to see you." "I want to talk to you about Mrs. Unthank," he said. "Should you be very unhappy if I sent her away and found some one younger and kinder to be your companion?" The idea seemed to be outside the bounds of her comprehension. "Mrs. Unthank would never go," she declared. "She stays here to listen to the voice. All night long sometimes she waits and listens, and it doesn't come. Then she hears it, and she is rested." "And you?" he asked. "I am afraid," she confessed. "But then, you see, I am not very strong." "You are not fond of Mrs. Unthank?" he enquired anxiously. "I don't think so," she answered in a perplexed tone. "I think I am very much afraid of her. But it is no use, Everard. She would never go away." "When I return," Dominey said, "we shall see." She took his arm and linked her hands through it. "I am so sorry that you are going," she murmured. "I hope you will soon come back. Will you come back, my husband?" Dominey's nails cut into the flesh of his clenched hands. "I will come back within 3 days," he promised. "Do you know," she went on confidentially, "something has come into my mind lately. I spoke about it yesterday, but I did not tell you what it was. You need never be afraid of me any more. I understand." "What do you understand?" he demanded huskily. "The knowledge must have come to me," she went on, dropping her voice a little and whispering almost in his ear, "at the very moment when my dagger rested upon your throat, when I suddenly felt the desire to kill die away. You are very like him sometimes. But you are not Everard. You are not my husband at all. You are another man." Dominey gave a little gasp. They both turned towards the door. Mrs. Unthank was standing there, her gaunt, hard face lit up with a gleam of something which was like triumph, her eyes glittering. Her lips, as though involuntarily, repeated her mistress' last words. "Another man." End of chapter 13. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 14 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 14. There were times during their rapid journey when Seaman, studying his companion, became thoughtful. Dominey seemed indeed to have passed beyond the boundaries of any ordinary reserve, to have become like a man enmeshed in the toils of a past so absorbing that he moved as though in a dream, speaking only when necessary and comporting himself generally like one to whom all externals have lost significance. As they embarked upon the final stage of their travels, Seaman leaned forward in his seat in the sombrely upholstered, overheated compartment. "Your home-coming seems to depress you, von Ragastein," he said. "It was not my intention," Dominey replied, "to set foot in Germany again for many years." "The past still bites?" "Always." The train sped on through long chains of vineyard-covered hills, out into a stretch of flat country, into forests of pines, in the midst of which were great cleared spaces, where, notwithstanding the closely drawn windows, the resinous odour from the fallen trunks seemed to permeate the compartment. Presently they slackened speed. Seaman glanced at his watch and rose. "Prepare yourself, my friend," he said. We descend in a few minutes." Dominey glanced out of the window. "But where are we?" he inquired. "Within 5 minutes of our destination." "But there is not a house in sight," Dominey remarked wonderingly. "You will be received on board His Majesty's private train," Seaman announced. "The Kaiser, with his staff, is making one of his military tours. We are honoured by being permitted to travel back with him as far as the Belgian frontier." They had come to a standstill now. A bearded and uniformed official threw open the door of their compartment, and they stepped on to the narrow wooden platform of a small station which seemed to have been recently built of fresh pine planks. The train, immediately they had alighted, passed on. Their journey was over. A brief conversation was carried on between Seaman and the official, during which Dominey took curious note of his surroundings. Around the station, half hidden in some places by the trees and shrubs, was drawn a complete cordon of soldiers, who seemed to have recently disembarked from a military train which stood upon a siding. In the middle of it was a solitary saloon carriage, painted black, with much gold ornamentation, and having emblazoned upon the central panel the royal arms of Germany. Seaman, when he had finished his conversation, took Dominey by the arm and led him across the line towards it. An officer received them at the steps and bowed punctiliously to Dominey, at whom he gazed with much interest. "His Majesty will receive you at once," he announced. "Follow me." They boarded the train and passed along a richly carpeted corridor. Their guide paused and pointed to a small retiring room where several men were seated. "Herr Seaman will find friends there," he said. "His Imperial Majesty will receive him for a few minutes later. The Baron von Ragastein will come this way." Dominey was ushered now into the main saloon. His guide motioned him to remain near the entrance, and, himself advancing a few paces, stood at the salute before a seated figure who was bending over a map which a stern-faced man in the uniform of a general had unrolled before him. The Kaiser glanced up at the sound of footsteps and whispered something in the general's ear. The latter clicked his heels together and retired. The Kaiser beckoned Dominey to advance. "The Baron von Ragastein, Your Majesty," the young officer murmured. Dominey stood at attention for a moment and bowed a little awkwardly. The Kaiser smiled. "It pleases me," he said, "to see a German officer ill at ease without his uniform. Count, you will leave us. Baron von Ragastein, be seated." "Sir Everard Dominey, at your service, Majesty," Dominey replied, as he took the chair to which his august host pointed. "Thorough in all things, I see," the latter observed. "Sit there and be at your ease. Good reports have reached me of your work in Africa." "I did my best to execute your Majesty's will," Dominey ventured. "You did so well," the Kaiser pronounced, "that my counsellors were unanimous in advising your withdrawal to what will shortly become the great centre of interest. From the moment of receiving our commands you appear to have displayed initiative. I gather that your personation of this English baronet has been successfully carried through?" "Up to the present, Your Majesty." "Important though your work in Africa was," the Kaiser continued, "your present task is a far greater one. I wish to speak to you for these few minutes without reserve. First, though, drink a toast with me." From a mahogany stand at his elbow, the Kaiser drew out a long-necked bottle of Moselle, filled two very beautiful glasses, passed one to his companion, and raised the other. "To the Fatherland," he said. "To the Fatherland," Dominey repeated. They set down their glasses empty. The Kaiser threw back the great military cloak which he was wearing, displaying a long row of medals and decorations. His fingers still toyed with the stem of his wine-glass. He seemed for a moment to lose himself in thought. His hard and somewhat cruel mouth was tightly closed. There was a slight frown upon his forehead. He was sitting upright, taking no advantage of the cushioned back of his easy-chair, his eyes a little screwed up, the frown deepening. For quite 5 minutes there was complete silence. One might have gathered that, turning aside from great matters, he had been devoting himself entirely to the scheme in which Dominey was concerned. "Von Ragastein," he said at last, I have sent for you to have a few words concerning your habitation in England. I wish you to receive your impressions of your mission from my own lips." "Your Majesty does me great honour," Dominey murmured. "I wish you to consider yourself," the Kaiser continued, "as entirely removed from the limits, the authority, and the duties of my espionage system. From you I look for other things. I desire you to enter into the spirit of your assumed position. As a typical English country gentleman, I desire you to study the labour question, the Irish question, the progress of this National Service scheme, and other social movements of which you will receive notice in due time. I desire a list compiled of those writers who, in the reviews or by means of fiction, are encouraging the suspicions which I am inclined to fancy England has begun to entertain towards the Fatherland. These things are all on the fringe of your real mission. That, I believe, our admirable friend Seaman has already confided to you. It is to seek the friendship, if possible the intimacy, of Prince Terniloff." The Kaiser paused, and once more his eyes wandered to the landscape which rolled away from the plate glass windows of the car. They were certainly not the eyes of a dreamer, and yet in those moments they seemed filled with brooding pictures. "The Princess has already received me graciously," Dominey confided. "Terniloff is the dove of peace," the Kaiser pronounced. "He carries the sprig of olive in his mouth. My statesmen and councillors would have sent to London an ambassador with sterner qualities. I preferred not. Terniloff is the man to gull fools, because he is a fool himself. He is a fit ambassador for a country which has not the wit to arm itself on land as well as by sea, when it sees a nation, mightier, more cultured, more splendidly led than its own, creeping closer every day." "The English appear to put their whole trust in their navy, your Majesty," Dominey observed tentatively. The eyes of his companion flashed. His lips curled contemptuously. "Fools!" he exclaimed. "Of what use will their navy be when my sword is once drawn, when I hold the coast towns of Calais and Boulogne, when my cannon command the Straits of Dover? The days of insular nations are past, past as surely as the days of England's arrogant supremacy upon the seas." The Kaiser refilled his glass and Dominey's. "In some months' time, Von Ragastein," he continued, "you will understand why you have been enjoined to become the friend and companion of Terniloff. You will understand your mission a little more clearly than you do now. Its exact nature waits upon developments. You can at all times trust Seaman." Dominey bowed and remained silent. His companion continued after another brief spell of silent brooding. "Von Ragastein," he said, "my decree of banishment against you was a just one. The morals of my people are as sacred to me as my oath to win for them a mightier empire. You first of all betrayed the wife of one of the most influential noblemen of a state allied to my own, and then, in the duel that followed, you slew him." "It was an accident, your Majesty," Dominey pleaded. "I had no intention of even wounding the Prince." The Kaiser frowned. All manner of excuses were loathsome to him. "The accident should have happened the other way," he rejoined sharply. "I should have lost a valuable servant, but it was your life which was forfeit, and not his. Still, they tell me that your work in Africa was well and thoroughly done. I give you this one great chance of rehabilitation. If your work in England commends itself to me, the sentence of exile under which you suffer shall be rescinded." "Your Majesty is too good," Dominey murmured. "The work, for its own sake, will command my every effort, even without the hope of reward." "That," the Kaiser said, "is well spoken. It is the spirit, I believe, with which every son of my empire regards the future. I think that they, too, more especially those who surround my person, have felt something of that divine message which has come to me. For many years I have, for the sake of my people, willed peace. Now that the time draws near when Heaven has shown me another duty, I have no fear but that every loyal German will bow his head before the lightnings which will play around my sword, and share with me the iron will to wield it. Your audience is finished, Baron von Ragastein. you will take your place with the gentlemen of my suite in the retiring room. We shall proceed within a few minutes, and leave you at the Belgian frontier." Dominey rose, bowed stiffly, and backed down the carpeted way. The Kaiser was already bending once more over the map. Seaman, who was waiting outside the door of the anteroom, called him in and introduced him to several members of the suite. One, a young man with a fixed monocle, scars upon his face, and a queer puppet-like carriage, looked at him a little strangely. "We met some years ago in Munich, Baron," he remarked. "I acknowledge no former meetings with any one in this country," Dominey replied stiffly. "I obey the orders of my imperial master when I wipe from my mind every episode or reminiscence of my former days." The young man's face cleared, and Seaman, by his side, who had knitted his brows thoughtfully, nodded understandingly. "You are certainly a good actor, Baron," he declared. "Even your German has become a little English. Sit down and join us in a glass of beer. Luncheon will be served to us here in a few minutes. You will not be recalled to the Presence until we set you down." Dominey bowed stiffly and took his place with the others. The train had already started. Dominey gazed thoughtfully out of the window. Seaman, who was waiting about for his audience, patted him on the arm. "Dear friend," he said, "I sympathise with you. You sorrow because your back is now to Berlin. Still, remember this, that the day is not far off when the sentence of exile against you will be annulled. You will have expiated that crime which, believe me, although I do not venture to claim a place amongst them, none of your friends or equals have ever regarded in the same light as His Imperial Majesty." A smiling steward in black livery with white facings made his appearance and served them with beer in tall glasses. The senior officer there, who had now seated himself opposite to Dominey, raised his glass and bowed. "To the Baron von Ragastein," he said, "whose acquaintance I regret not having made before to-day. May we soon welcome him back, a brother in arms, a companion in great deeds. Hoch!" Chapter 14. Recording by Tom Weiss.